All right, today, as a reflection, I will be thinking about the Salvation Army, particularly to see what they have to say about themselves and also take a look at their discussion guide that was put out by the International Social Justice Commission. They have a work called Let's Talk About Racism. Now, thankfully, I was able to get a copy of this before they removed it from the internet. And in fact, it was me hearing about that they had removed it from the internet that drew me to see if there was a catched web page version. And sure enough, I was able to get the document a day after it had been officially removed from their website. The reason why I think looking at this document is important is because there is difference of opinion as to what this document means for the organization as a whole. And I've looked at a few different things. I've watched a few different videos from the Salvation Army. And I wanted to start today by looking at an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal by Kenny Shue entitled Wokeness Infiltrates the Salvation Army. It backs away from a call on members to lament, repent, and apologize for racism. All right, so we're going to first look at this article, and I'm going to reflect upon it. This is kind of a Catholic reflection upon this particular perspective, and then we're going to also look at the document, particularly its Appendix D. I think it's Appendix D. I'll correct it if I'm wrong on that, but it's entitled What is Whiteness? So I'm reading from the article Wokeness Infiltrates the Salvation Army by Kenny Shue. Quote, although the Salvation Army was founded in London in 1865, it's in America that its red kettles have become a Christmas staple. The Salvationists have earned broad respect in American society after more than a century of charitable giving, but an internal coalition of woke ideologues now endangers the organization's reputation. Now, I will say off the bat that the Salvation Army, in its language and official statements, rejects this. Hey, welcome in, F Symbols. Good to see you. And I'll reflect on that in a moment. But as I'm reading, if I don't comment upon the article, it's probably because I agree with what it's saying. And that's based on also looking at and listening to the Salvation Army's official response to this. My interpretation in general is that they kind of went down the wrong path in discussing some of these things. As we'll see, they actually recommend to read Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, for instance. If you wanted to discuss the topic of racism, there's a lot better books that aren't written in a very specific ideological manner. Despite the fact that the Salvation Army has began to go down that road in its thinking, in terms, at least this particular document we'll be reading, that they say is used for internal discussion, the implications are is that they take those thoughts seriously enough to even recommend. Okay, so I think that the Salvation Army went down the wrong path in their thinking on some of this stuff. They got wrapped up into it, and now is trying to save face, all right, and try to claim that, they're not on the left, they're not on the right, they're not taking any political stances, which, unfortunately, any public position that one takes concerning how you interpret a society is inherently political. It's about the polis, it's about the city, it's about the polity and the policies. Too often people use this language as if there is a kind of neutrality where you have certain ideas about the human condition or about economics or government, or where it doesn't end up aligning with thoughts that may be predominant on the left or the right, or thoughts that are more centrist and so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting is that as we go through this, it does appear that they get a lot of backlash, and I think appropriately so, in terms of that they began to not just want to discuss, but actively encourage people to read these sources as good starting points for discussion, not to critique, but to actually be educated by these ideas. Now, that's a totally different attitude. All right. Anyways, the article continues as this year, the Salvation Army's International Social Justice Commission published a discussion guide called Let's Talk About Racism. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I did download that, and I will be reading from it for this video. The document, its authors say, was designed to stimulate gracious discussion among Salvationists who choose to participate. So one is, in the way they're saying this, is they want to distance themselves from the idea that this is the way that they want Salvationists to think. And by Salvationist, I mean people who are members of the Salvation Army. And that this is just a discussion guide for those who want to participate in certain discussions. Part of the problem is that when I forget what what's his name? I didn't catch his name, but he's the head general. Let's see. He talks about how he doesn't take their views from any particular ideology and society, but exclusively from Scripture. But when you read their writing, all it is echoing critical race theory. All right. I didn't see a lot of Scripture in it. That's not to say that I didn't miss it. But what stood out to me the most was that they were presenting some of these more race hustling individuals like Robin DiAngelo and Abram X Kendi's, like those two books, White Fragility and How to Be an Anti-Racist, are two of the many books that they have on their resource list. All right. So for them to say that they are not participating in ideas that are almost exclusively coming from radical left ideologies, all right, social Marxist attempts to kind of disintegrate American society, It doesn't sound to me to be a mere appeal to the gospel, but I don't want to go too far into that quite yet. I'll allow Kenny Shue to explain his opinion in the Wall Street Journal. He continues, why is it so difficult to acknowledge the sin of racism and the seeking of God's forgiveness, both individually as believers and corporately as the church, for our complicity in racism? Well, number one, if an individual has been complicit and are morally culpable in doing so, then I don't see why there would be much difficulty in acknowledging that they have participated in some way in the sin of racism. It's an interesting question because really when you get down to it, this difficulty that they're talking about perhaps could be said of any fault that people have. Do we have a tendency in general to acknowledge sins in which we have participated in, or do we avoid them or ignore them? And how a person responds to that would be characteristic of their disposition in general, right? So it's not something that's specific to any one sin at all, right? The article goes on to say, it also called on Salvationists to, quote, stop trying to be colorblind and to lament, repent, and apologize for their biases against people of color in America. Number one, that against people of color in America is not in quotation. So my initial thought would be whether or not this article is biased. It is an opinion piece, so it is going to be inherently taking a particular position. But I did notice in the glossary of this particular work, it defines racism specifically as something against people of color. Well, that's problematic unless by color they mean any skin color. That seems to be one of the problems with critical race theory, is this notion that somehow it is impossible for people of color to participate in the sin of racism against other people. First of all, I think the problem is with the language and the concept that usually follows it. We, in general, as Christians, from a Catholic perspective, we just see people. Now, this stop trying to be colorblind, end quote, as the document says. The problem with that language, that is a term of derision that the left would use of somebody on the right who tries to say that color doesn't make any difference. And normally what they mean by that is that they don't really group people according to certain characteristics that they might have. That might be of interest when we are looking at statistics, when it comes to like demographics and things of that nature, maybe voting habits, or health. Medical doctors should be very keen on the propensity towards certain ailments of people of different gene pools. That's why they always ask about your family history, for instance. Now, once again, from a Christian perspective, there are different cultures, right? So there's different foods, different music, different dance, different dress, different clothing. I think I said that. Different stories. There's lots of different styles of government, economic systems, so on and so forth. That is how people kind of structure themselves. But specifically when it comes to people in general, there is a great appreciation for all things human. But the problem with some of the attempt to categorize people outside of we're just human beings, all right, is not to discount the fact that there are other differences among us, like hair color, eye color, skin color, things of that nature. But it kind of makes me curious, though, why skin color happens to be something that is very specific to history instead of eye color, for example. Why isn't the color of people's eyes the dominant feature that people seem to try to group people into? Like, perhaps because skin color is the most seen, perhaps, but it's just another example of genetic variation within the human species. So, scientifically speaking, we're just looking at characteristics of various characteristics of the human species. Some people have used those characteristics to define one group of people with one characteristic as being inferior to the other. And generally, this is what we think of when we think of racism. We're thinking that somehow there is this perfect set of genes that make you somehow superior or more human, so to speak. And whether or not some people are attempting to do this, but anytime you really start to put people in categories and pit them against other people of other categories, it's going to sow seeds of division and separation and segregation between people. That's not being colorblind. That is looking at humanity from an objective standpoint, right? All right, the article continues here. We must stop denying the existence of, this is a quote from the material. We must stop denying the existence of individual and systemic institutional racism. Now, what's interesting is that the head of the Salvation Army has said in a few different videos that that they didn't say that America was an inherently racist country, right? But yet they'll say stuff like this, right? Now, depending on where this is said, no doubt this is in the context, because it also says they exist and are still at work to keep white Americans in power. All right. This is the language that comes directly from the Salvation Army document. So I think that either the head of the Salvation Army doesn't really understand where this kind of language comes from, all right, and doesn't really understand the full implications of how this is applied and how it is explained by the document, because the way he talks and exactly what he says in his document, that they're not on the left, they're not on the right, but find me, a handful of people on the right that supports this kind of language, right? That thinks that there are structures in place, systemic. They're actual, like, institutionalized laws to keep white Americans in power, whatever that's supposed to mean, right? Especially when we see so many examples to the contrary. The article continues, after a torrent of criticism, and I think rightfully so, the document was taken down in November with a statement that said the, quote, guide led some to believe we think they should apologize for the color of their skin, or that the Salvation Army may have abandoned its biblical beliefs for another philosophy or ideology. That was never our intention. That's interesting language. So the guide has been removed for appropriate review. It's bizarre that the guide was ever published at all. I do agree, because when I read the appendix, D, I think it is, what is whiteness? It goes on to define what whiteness is. And as I've already mentioned, the document, in effect, I might as well just bring it up. Let's see here. Let's talk about racism. They have a section on defining terms. So listen to the definition, okay, that they give for racism. And you can kind of have an idea. Number one, it's defining intersectionality. Let me see if I can find... Oh, yeah, listen to this. Institutional racism. Listen to this definition that this document gives. Occurs in an organization. These are discriminatory treatments, unfair policies, or biased practices based on race that result in inequitable outcomes for whites over people of color. All right. It's defining privilege. It's defining microaggression. It defines racism as, quote, a prejudice against someone based on race when those prejudices are reinforced by systems of power, which it doesn't have to. All right. It can just be a prejudice against... See, this is a rewriting of the definition of racism. It could include power, but whether it does or it doesn't, it is still a prejudice against someone based on their race. So putting that particular spin on it is an attempt to say that the whites are in power, and so therefore racism can only be against people of color, which, once again, what does that mean? And I have a color too. So the definition continues, the prejudiced treatment, stereotyping, or discrimination of people of color on the basis of race. So racism can only be against people of color, and it's all capitalized there. So basically what they mean is non-whites. Why are you engaging in this language? It continues. I'm going to stop there. So you can kind of just tell by the language that is being used in the document as I've read it. I mean, it's straight out of Abram X. Kendi, right? It's very, very clear. Hey, Yoshi, welcome in. Good to see you. All right, let's go back to the Wall Street Journal. I really need to read more before I start commenting. Okay, especially since it came with an endorsement from the Salvation Army's highest-ranking official, Brian Peddle, who is from Canada. Mr. Peddle said of Let's Talk About Racism that it guides gracious discussions about overcoming the damage racism has inflicted upon our world and, yes, on our Salvation Army. Of all the organizations to describe as racist, the Salvation Army is particularly unlikely. It released one of the world's first non-discrimination ordinances in 1898. I've been told that some 60% of its service in the United States is dedicated to minority populations. It's true that the Army's higher-ranking officials are disproportionately white, reflecting the organization's origins in Britain and the United States, but there is no question that these intergenerational families' commitments are sincere, and the Salvation Army has been getting significantly more racially diverse over the past 50 years, which is good. You know, if people are interested in joining the Salvation Army, then join the Salvation Army. I don't see why that's a thing. It appointed as its first black national commander in 2006. Mr. Gaither has said that the future is absolutely wide open to African American Salvationists who would be available for God's use as officers. Was there a policy in place that said otherwise? Strange as it may seem, the document is standard fare for an expanding diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracy. This language of diversity, equity, and inclusion are kind of talking words or talking points for this progressive ideology because of what they mean by it. Both of these, all three of these terms, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are what you would refer to as relative values. So, number one, if we properly define each of these and understand them as relative values, that is, that they have their value in association with absolute values. They don't stand alone, all right? They also are supposed to be deeply rooted in justice, right? Which is to give to people what they deserve, and love, which is to will the good of the other for the sake of the other, not the sake of oneself, right? So in using this language, people can put any kind of definitions or ideology on top of it. So if you go to a college and they have a diversity, equity, inclusion officer, it's probably because what they really mean by that is that they're pushing more progressive ideologies, right? And so for that, it becomes very politicized. And yes, it is politics. Anything that has to do with policy concerning the polis is politics, right? The Salvation Army relying on a narrative of systemic racism to justify the administrator's role, right? So they're relying on a narrative of systemic racism to justify the role of this administrator to expanding diversity, equity, and inclusion. The Salvation Army has installed 2 new directors, DEI directors, right? The diversity, equity, inclusion, with the goal of having a representative in every division and command. So perhaps the Salvation Army went this route to more corporate giving. I'm not going to agree or disagree with why the Salvation Army kind of decided to go this route, but I do think that either A, they are completely unaware of the source of this stuff, and they've just kind of adopted it as that can't. It's difficult for me to give that kind of charitable interpretation to it. And when I say charitable, I would say overly charitable. I think I'm bending over backwards to try to give them more benefit of the doubt than is really merited to any situation. How the Salvation Army has looked at and understood and thought about racism 50 years prior should be no different than the way they look at it today if it's based on biblical principles. So why adopt the language of Robin DiAngelo and Abram X. Kendi? Why adopt the new critical race theory paradigm and ideology in order to reinterpret, as a lens through which to view this whole particular issue? Though it is unfortunate that I don't want to say that the Salvation Army is now trying to lie to us by saying it's not on the left or not on the right, despite the fact that all of its values are held by the right, and need I remind you, and try to say to us that it's not holding to any particular ideology, but it's just holding to the gospel. But if that was true, then just quote scripture to talk about how we're all created in the image and likeness of God exclusively. But that's not what this discussion guide was trying to promote and encourages and recommends. That's the problem. So I think they're trying to do some PR damage control. They're trying to backpedal some stuff on this, particularly in removing it. You know what I mean? Hey, welcome in. I'm sorry, I didn't see what you were saying there. They suggested you to follow this channel. Oh, very cool. I don't know why. I have a really bad memory, so I don't even remember who that is. You know. Yeah. As opposed to singing words. Quick question. All right, so the question is, when did you hit rock bottom that your weak mind had to resort to believe in magic just to get by each day? Magic? I don't hold the magic. So now that you've been dissuaded from that, I hope that puts your question to rest. All right. And I see you created your account an hour ago, so you're just a troll account. So goodbye to you. All right. Go back to it here. All right. So perhaps the Salvation Army went this route to court more corporate giving. Large corporations are abuzz with diversity, equity, and inclusion in this current national moment. And access to corporate funds likely requires a certain level of woke speak. It's unclear what the source of this really is. It's unclear. But I know that the Salvation Army, for good or for ill, they are deeply involved in dealing with like social issues, a lot of social action in the Salvation Army. To give you an example, I used to work at Nazarene Bible College, and we had opened up our we had a series of courses for ministry development, and the Salvation Army had partnered with our college to help them go from an associate's degree to a bachelor's degree through what they called, I'm trying to remember the name of the program now. They called it the Advantage Program. It was an accelerated program where they'd spend like, I want to say 1 year, but that doesn't sound right if they're doing 2 years worth of coursework. But a lot of them were doing like leadership and like pastoral ministries and stuff like that. And a lot of these people had a very similar story to share with me. One particular, it was a husband and wife, which isn't an uncommon thing, where they're both the pastors of a particular local, I don't know if they call it a church or what have you, corpse maybe, yeah, CORPS. They really like that army language. But anyways, they were together working like 70 hours a week. I mean, these people were overworked, and they were dropping out of the program because their lives were so unbalanced that they spent so much time actively engaged in all of this work that they're doing that they didn't even have much time left for their education. So it almost seems like this is the kind of education they should have gotten before they engaged in that work. Or they needed to do massive delegation for several years just so that they would be able to participate in all of that. Quite tough, you know what I mean? Oh, I'm sorry, Yoshi. I just I just caught what you're saying there. You've been personally hurt by this stuff that I had to leave my home church. Yeah, I'm deeply sorry to hear that. I'm not reading their whole document. Actually, what I'm reading right now is an opinion piece from the Wall Street Journal. But I did read some of the definitions, but I will be reading their one portion of the document just because it's a long document, to be quite honest. Right. This article is almost done. Perhaps, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Yet, in the process of chasing corporations, which I don't know if that's what their motive was, the Salvation Army is alienating ordinary givers like the ones who faithfully donate to the Red Kettle campaign. The organization Color Us United, of which I serve as president, this is Mr. Kenny Shu, I think it's how it's pronounced, has organized a broad base of more than 16,000 donors who have started speaking up. A second-generation Salvation Army donor wrote that until the Salvation Army admits its error, denounces these woke views, and turns back to their original foundations, I will not support it financially or otherwise. And this is echoed among others as well, the same kind of sentiment that they are withholding their support of the organization. The Salvation Army has suggested the guide will be replaced. It should release a statement making clear that America isn't a racist country. Now, what's interesting is that the document never uses that language, but it's implied. It's implied in very undeniable language, as I had spoken before about how it talks about institutionalized racism, for instance. This is a moment of the organization's leaders to truly take a stand against wokeness and for the ordinary goodness of its members, as they've done throughout history. All right, so that's the opinion piece. So I'm going to now read Appendix. Let's see, which one is it? Appendix C. Self-care for people of color, like even using that language. Okay, Appendix D. What is whiteness? This is coming from their woke document. All right, I have not read this. All right, I have not read this. So this is a live reading of What is Whiteness. This is in the Salvation Army Let's Talk About Racism document that is what people have been talking about. All right. It doesn't seem to have a single author. Okay, and there's a little bit here, so I'll try to stick to the text, but I'll wander a little bit. As we explore the social impact of race in America, particularly on Black Americans, it is important to acknowledge the shift or awakening many white Americans go through as they learn about the experiences of other cultures in America. I'll skip that. Major Brian Jones writes about his personal experience of realizing how the social construct of whiteness affected him. It sounds like he just read Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility book and literally just internalized it, right? All right, so it looks like he's telling a story here. He says, quote, I was born into the generation of a Donna Reed and Father Knows Best television programs. From my perspective, these shows depicted American life. They showed us how to behave and what the average American family looked like. Everything was pretty and white, with a picket fence and manicured lawn. However, as I look back upon it, there was something missing. Color. It was just vanilla. That was the world of my childhood, and I knew nothing else because I had never been exposed to anything but white Midwestern American culture. Then at the age of 12, I moved to California, and my world began to change. Yeah, you're in California. It's not like you moved to a conservative community in Texas. Your views may begin to change if you just move to California, and then at the age of 12 get public school education there. Give it some thought, right? All right. Let's see. Suddenly I began to see people of other races and nationalities, speaking languages I was unfamiliar with. Okay. While they were present around me and I saw them, I didn't ever see these different groups of people. I didn't see. What do you mean you didn't see? They remained invisible to me and were far removed from the world I lived in. The cultural norms were set by the dominant white culture, and every other culture was expected to follow suit. What does that even mean? There were givens in my culture. I'm not sure what givens is. Givens in my culture, such as racial superiority, needing to be at the front of every line, and entitlement to privileges others do not have. Like what? It just sounds like he's just quoting the book. I recall being in a group in which I was helped first before people of color. Like, see, he's using this language. Like, how is... I have no idea what the year is here at this point. He said he was born into the generation of Donna Reed and Father Knows Best television programs. If it's talking about like 1940, 1950, the culture was different back then. So, yeah, things were changing back then. It's 2020. Everybody that has been born in the last 40 years has been born in a culture where there is equality of opportunity for everyone. What really holds people back is not a lack of money. It's a lack of intelligence, a lack of aptitude, a lack of ingenuity, a lack of attitude. It's not money. When I hear stories like this, I think I grew up in a trailer park. Neither parent at that time had any college education. We were poor. My father played guitar in a bar, and my mother was shutting off meters for a local power company. Not exactly a rich environment to grow up in. very humble beginnings, right? Anyways, let me get to this. In restaurants, I witnessed white people, including myself, send their food back simply because it wasn't hot enough or wasn't good enough for them. So, if you pay for a product, don't you expect that it's going to be hot or of good quality? What's wrong with this person? There was an inherent right to complain until your demands were met. You mean the basic expectation that a product is going to be of good quality? This guy has a doctorate, need I remind you. These unwritten rules were handed down from generation to generation, like an unspoken holy grail. I don't recall exactly how these messages were handed down to me, but the actions and words of others create a certain mentality. I saw myself and my family as superior, strictly because of the color of my skin. And I expected, whether consciously or unconsciously, to be treated as privileged. It's 2020. I'm over 40 years old. I have never encountered that mentality within myself. Because of my skin? I don't know. Sometimes I kind of wish I had a darker pigment because I can like see my veins and stuff. You know? I don't know. Sometimes, I wish I didn't see the veins in my hands. Well, who knows? Maybe I haven't looked at a lot of hands. Maybe you can see a lot of veins in other hands too. But as I'm thinking with the lighter pigment, it's maybe more pronounced to see the greenish blue veins. Maybe I sunburn more easily. I don't know. Is that true? It doesn't seem too privileged in that perspective. Hey, Devil, welcome in. All right, right now I'm reading What is Whiteness by the Salvation Army. One of the authors of this document is talking about his childhood when he was 12 living in California. I was given tools and resources that gave me an upper hand in life, and I expected to receive a better education and more rights and opportunities. I think in general, people tend to want the best education they can get, the most opportunities they can get. But he's talking as if this is a bad thing. That this is like a wrong expectation to have. Sometimes people seem to idolize money instead of family and people. I didn't deserve these things, but I accepted them. Is that what you thought then, or what you think now? I had an extra jump on everyone else. Everyone? This is a doctorate. He can write more clear. I'm sorry to be. He needs to be more refined and more specific. That was the white culture I belonged to, and I never viewed it as privilege. It was the way things were. I've been told by Progressive Now that white people don't have a culture of their own. And here he is talking about a white culture, and he's using it in a pejorative sense. So yeah, white people don't have a culture, so they say. Or if there is a white culture, it's a bad culture. And it's only one, and it's privileged, and it's racist. He goes on to say, when I was a young adult, a social and political revolution began to take place, and those movements began an awakening within me. The civil rights and anti-war movements opened my mind to new ideas and realities, and I began to think in a new way. So basically what he's saying, let me add this. I also became a Christian during that time and realized that I needed to treat everyone equitably and with love, dignity, and respect. I highly doubt he was using that term. But it kind of sounded like he kind of grew up as a young adult within when changes were taking place, right? If he's talking about civil rights movements and stuff. While at Fuller Seminary, I married an African American woman and was opened up to a whole new level of discrimination and racism. Now, I don't doubt that in our recent history there has been a kind of discouraging attitude towards interracial relations. All right. Some of that may not be because people are necessarily being mean, although people can be mean. Sin is rooted in the human heart. It's from the human heart that comes, all of these depraved things. But it certainly wasn't very common. It was becoming more common. People weren't exposed to it. When I went to elementary school, there was a mixed bag of people in there. I didn't think any different. But I can see if I had gone to a school where everybody had the same skin color as mine, and then I moved to a school where I was the only person with my skin color, and noticed a culture shock. I can see me feeling uncomfortable about that, particularly because kids can be mean too. And again, I'm still talking about elementary school. Any difference between two individuals, it doesn't even have to be skin color. It could be the way a person talks, it could be their mannerisms, it could be whether they have good English or bad English. Any particular difference was used to be a source of being mean or something like that. You never tried seeing my veins? Yeah, I can. Hey, Stannis, welcome in. Yeah, I can notice them. I've they're very apparent on me because I'm quite pale, so I can see my veins and stuff. I mean, it's not a bad thing. It's just, I guess it's just a thing I feel awkward about, maybe. I lost a tooth. Yeah, I don't care to put a stud or something in there. So, I'm equal. I'm more, because I'm not quite used to having the tooth gone. So I'm not smiling as much as I used to. Or I smile with my face. Anywho, let's continue his story. Yeah. After Fuller Seminary, I became a Salvation Army officer and joined my wife in her ongoing ministry as an officer. Initially, we had to overcome the concerns, and even outright bigotry of family members. It's possible that people say something, but we endured it in our ministry, right? Yeah, people just need to get used to stuff like that, That stuff does, those kind of biases and criticisms can exist among people for sure. Yeah, absolutely. They can, and it's very unfortunate. And it goes every which way. Unfortunately, I was a substitute school teacher for a while, and I remember I was in a middle school classroom, and I watched for a few minutes as two black girls were criticizing this little white boy. I say little because he was quite a bit shorter than they were. It was a classroom that had two different grades in it, and apparently they got somewhat of a growth spurt and he didn't. But they were saying stuff like, "You're so white," and things like that. And I'm like, that's racist. It's just unfortunate. People do that kind of stuff to each other. It's unfortunate. Let's see. He says, our second apartment was in La Grande. It's a small town in eastern Oregon. Little did we know that eastern Oregon was a hotbed for bias against them. Against them? This is your own story. But the fact that they and many others go through similar experiences further opened my eyes to the racism POCs deal with every day in the United States. Not to mention racism going the other way as well. Let's see. This is really jumping. Okay, he says, white supremacy in our small town was no exception. When we arrived, once again, they're still not telling me what the year is. When we arrived, we were met with stares and unwelcoming expressions. That's very vague, especially stares. People are going to look at you. Deal with it. Corps members stopped coming, and several people made it explicitly clear that it was because of our interracial marriage. Well, that's unfortunate. Yeah, that's unfortunate. They probably heard bad things about interracial marriage. I'll give you an example. I was talking to this lady once. I must have been in my 20s, if I remember correctly. And we were talking about interracial marriage. I think we were just talking about marriage in general. She was having like a Bible study at her house. And she said, it's not wrong to have interracial marriages. Just know that there could be additional challenges, particularly because you may have grown up in totally different cultures, having different values. And I'm like, that stuff is pretty typical of some marriages. But I think that the point that she was trying to make is that it's an additional difference. It's an additional difference that could make their marriage a little more challenging. And I think that what she was trying to do is she just wanted to encourage us to find someone whom we had the most common with, in all respects. And marriage typically could be a little more easier without having certain differences. So I think she was meaning well in that. And I think in that there was certainly a point taken. But anyways, this is an unfortunate experience that he had. See, multiple individuals called me a traitor for breaking the unwritten rule of marrying outside of my race. Multiple individuals. Now, you have to understand these people are not acting like members of the Salvation Army when they're saying this type of stuff. And there were times in American history, in like the 50s, 70s, and stuff like that, or 60s, that time frame when there was a shift in things that were going on. You can actually go back and watch. There were several Quantum Leap episodes where you can kind of get a glimpse into stuff like that. Movies like Driving Miss Daisy and things like that, you can kind of get a glimpse of the way people were treating each other and stuff. Very unfortunate period of time. From the 50s, when some of that stuff was quite prevalent, we're now 70 years later. Some people could still harbor some of that stuff for sure. And having individuals do this, certainly would be different than the whole congregation saying, no, you got to get out of here. That's horrible. In addition, my wife and children were subjected to additional scrutiny. Ooh, they're watching, In La Grande, all the people, I don't like using this expression, people of color, because I'm a person of color. Look, see. I have Indian in my heritage. You know that? And both my my dad and mom's side of the family. So I am a descendant of Indian heritage. I am the example of a mutt. All the people of color literally lived on one side of the train tracks in a small community. Well, I suppose if they wanted to do that, I wouldn't tell people how to live their lives. We, however, lived in a more affluent and all-white community. Well, if they don't want to live in your community, then let them live where they want. Yeah, particularly because, here's another good example. If you watch the movie Crossroads, that was actually a very good film. If you've never seen it, it's got that Ralph Macchio guy or whatever his name is, and it was kind of interesting. They were down south, I think they were down in Mississippi or whatnot, and on one side of the street they had a very well lit bar, and everybody had lighter skin, and they had country outfits, country music, very rambunctious. And then they went across the street to another bar where there was nobody with light colored skin. It was dimly lit. They had blues and jazz and stuff like that. And I think one of the challenges in looking at that kind of stuff is that just across the street there was a totally different culture. And so I can imagine that over time, because of those cultures, kind of people grow up and are enculturated in one side of the street or the other, for instance, or one side of the train tracks or the other. And then imagine the way that people probably felt. They probably felt uncomfortable initially when there was the ending of segregation, and there was this integration into schools, hospitals, and basically everything else. I can see the ills of the human heart cropping up in situations like that make an already tense situation because of the cultural conflict there, all the more difficult. Which that kind of stuff is unfortunate. I consider myself fortunate not to have lived during a period of time in our country and a lot of healing had to occur, a lot of healing. It's good to be mindful of those types of things. I wouldn't want to create an entire ideology based upon it and only teach those things in American history. I think that would be a mistake, or to say that the ideas in the Constitution or the ideas in the Declaration of Independence or the ideas in the founding documents, its logic, its philosophy was all inherently racist is to say quite another thing that I think we should all reject, quite frankly. He goes on telling his story. My wife was pulled over by the police multiple times. I have been pulled over by the police multiple times, often with our children in the car. I didn't have children at the time. Simply to find out where she lived and where she was going. I was asked that once by a police officer. I'm not saying that there wasn't suspicion, there wasn't like with police officers. So this is an interesting spin-off on this topic, the profiling. What's kind of unfortunate about profiling is that, number one, it is good for police officers to be aware of the demographic in which they live and to be aware of crime statistics and stuff like that. You know, like if you pull somebody over, and let's be blunt, it's like a 80-year-old white dude in a Cadillac or something. And it just so happens that within that particular community, the crime rate is incredibly low. So the police are much more laxed. They're much more relaxed. They do a basic risk assessment and think, you know, I don't have to, I could be a little more casual with this stop, you know. Now, if it also happens to be that on another night he pulls over a 20-year-old person of color, that's what people want to hear, I guess, and they're driving what may appear to be an expensive vehicle for somebody of that age. I'm 40. I don't even have said vehicle, right? And it just happens to be in that community that the crime rate among that demographic is sky high. So immediately the police officer, with his training, and properly so, profiles the individual. So they're much more tense. They may even approach the car with their hand on their gun. They do a risk assessment, and they initially prepare themselves mentally. May even end up speaking in a sterner voice. These kind of things can happen when people are stressed, you know, particularly if in that county in the last 30 years there's been X amount of, you know, shootings against police at stops, you know, regarding that demographic. That's not their fault, nor is it the fault of anybody else who may also have those characteristics. The profiling, though, does help police to be able to be ready or more ready. You know what I mean? It makes sense that they may see lower or higher risk because of their understanding of the community, because of the demographics, because of the crime statistics and stuff like that. But you can see how that can also get out of hand, right? So it's perfectly justified in having more suspicion. I mean, I certainly would have more suspicion if the demographics actually justified it. See, that there's a difference between unjustified suspicion that's based on a personal bias, where there's no supporting facts, and actually being a police officer who's trained to understand the dynamics of your community and prepare themselves for what could be potentially high-risk situations, right? That can get out of hand too, you know. Police officers can actually handle that stuff wrong. Now, with this particular story, it's just told. You know, it kind of reminds me of the story that Michelle Obama once was told, where a woman cut in front of her in an ice cream line. And because the woman who cut in front of her didn't happen to have the exact same skin color as her, she assumed that it was a racist thing against her, instead of this person was just being rude. Or maybe they didn't like your politics, for example. It kind of reminds me of the recent tweet that AOC had made. I guess there were some criticisms of AOC's behavior, as there often is criticisms of her policy positions. And instead of seeing or publicly acknowledging that she's being attacked for specific things, she'll come out with something obscene or crazed like, you guys just want to have sex with me. Like, what? And I'm thinking, I don't like your policies. How did you get there? I don't know. There's just something that people do. They'll just jump to conclusions instead of being, a little more well balanced with it. But let me continue with this story. I'm not saying something in this story is not right. I'm just saying that just because somebody looked at you, you can read so much into a look. So maybe not. Simply to find where she lived and where she was going. Yep, that happened to me once too. Thankfully, after having been in the appointment for a year, our command heads listened to our concerns and moved us because the entrenched racial hatred we felt made it nearly impossible for us to stay. You felt this. Now, if they actually did experience that's unfortunate. And once again, it's still not telling me what year it is, because that does make a difference. If they're saying this stuff like 2020 in a diverse population that has been diverse for a while, then I would say, no, I think you're reading this stuff into what other people are doing or saying. If this is like in the 70s, 60s, 70s or something like that, I'm more inclined to see how they're interpreting it, right? He goes on to say, the fact that we were able to move is a privilege that is not lost on me. You're with the Salvation Army, that they let you move. These are examples of explicit racism we faced. Some of that was an interpretation, but okay, it's possible. I won't discount that they probably were experiencing some racism for the sake of the story. Not to mention the implicit racism that comes in the form of off-putting comments that push back officers of color receive for expressing their culture. Their culture? What is a officer of color's culture? And why is it in the singular? There isn't a single culture out there. There's various cultures. Most people born in America that we actually live in a kind of a multicultural environment, really. There's all kinds of different cultures. I like the fact I can go to a Chinese restaurant. They get Chinese art, Chinese food. Usually there's Chinese people, And for a moment I can imagine I'm in China or something. I think that's pretty cool. I think some of the reasons why people travel the world is to check out other cultures and stuff. There's all kinds of really good foods, art, music, dress, stories, places, architecture. It is actually really, really neat to see among people, and I think it's good for us to have exposure to a lot of that stuff. I think that's neat to be able to experience those things. I never dreamt. Okay, actually, Pushback. The ignorance of appropriate intercultural interactions, which some people may not have grown up being able to handle very well. That's very possible. And the outright denial of racism and white privileges. Once again, what year are we talking about? If you're talking about 2020, I'm going to say probably no. I never dreamt I would be confronted by such racism, but these experiences have strengthened my resolve to fight against the racism and injustice that exists in this country. I'm now a retired 67-year-old officer. So he's 67 now. So let me think about this. He's retired. Was he in his 20s when this happened? Now let me think about this. If he's 67, let's just say he's 70. He was born in the 50s. So he was 62 when he moved to California. It was 1962. So, yeah, I could see how that might be relevant to a 12-year-old who moved to California in 1962. I grant that for sure. He says, all right, I am now a retired 67-year-old officer who has seen similar struggles evolve over the past 40 or so years. But as Bob Dylan's saying, the times they are changing. Not sure what that means. We are witness to new social and political movements, bringing us close to living out Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's dream that we would all come together and sit down at the table of brotherhood to end racial inequality in the United States. All right, so it sounds like he is thinking that new social and political movements. Well, the only political movements would be progressivism. And the only social that I can think of that is quite prominent right now is critical race theory. And actually, those are more about judging people by the color of their skin as opposed to their character. Like people like Robin DiAngelo, they're constantly talking about race. People are talking about race all the time. Like, why are you talking about race all the time? Why can't you just emphasize that we just come from different gene pools? Heck, you don't even have to emphasize that. Just emphasize we're human beings and appreciate each other's differences and cultures along this particular line. You know, like I don't care. You know, any of those characteristics isn't going to change the fact that I think all human beings have been created in the image and likeness of God, right? Do I need any other criteria to determine how I will treat you, how I will see you? Nope. I don't need any criteria like that. He goes on to say, I echo Dr. King's sentiments in his I Have a Dream speech that states, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Yes, they are. Notice his language, that one day this nation will live up to this. One day. So he's saying we still have to march in step with a progressive movement towards something that's not yet. Who's not on board with this? It's 2022 now. Who isn't on board that we were all created equal? And notice he doesn't go on to say endowed by certain unalienable rights by our Creator. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together to... Who... Is this not already happening? He's talking as if he's looking at the world through the lens of 1962. Now, let's be honest. Like, who's using this language? I'm not so naive to believe that the struggle for human rights will be easy. This current movement and social revolution were birthed out of injustice and killings. Is this kind of like an allusion to people being shot? It's not this current movement. This was definitely written after the George Floyd incident, and there's no evidence that that was racist. I haven't seen it. That's the narrative. That's what some people have just absorbed because they've been told that over and over again. But is it actually true? Some people won't even grant the possibility because the narrative is so entrenched, and that's kind of unfortunate. I've since seen all kinds of things on the news that were supposed race crimes, and most of them were perpetrated by themselves. I don't remember their names, but or they've been fake, or there's been shootings where they were good shoots. But unfortunately, an individual decided to attack a police officer or resist arrest to the point to possibly bring harm to themselves or to others. That's unfortunate. That's because of their behavior. That's because of their inability to comply. I one time watched a video where it's unfortunate I had to speak in terms of race just to paint a picture of just how ridiculous this is, but a Mexican police officer, Hispanic, right, pulled over a black woman. I guess, I don't remember if it was like a tail light or something. Turned out she was also driving without her driver's license. And she was going off on that guy saying that you're a murderer just because he's a police officer. He's now a murderer, and she's like, you'll never be white and stuff like that. I'm like, can you imagine the level of indoctrination that these people are absorbing to actually believe what they're saying? This is a person who pulled you over because of a civil infraction, and immediately you go to race. It's like if the races were different, and by race I simply mean that there's very clear gene pool differences, but we're all human, part of the human race. Immediately, it has to be about that difference. It couldn't possibly be about the law. It couldn't be about their policies. It couldn't be about something that they've done that is wrong. It's just a smokescreen. It's just a diversion. That's not what it's really about. But it's kind of sickening to hear about it over and over and over and over again. If there's a clear case of explicit racism, okay, I agree with you. There's actual facts to back up what is being said. But I'm not just going to buy a narrative blindly because you keep telling me. I'm just not going to do it. Like Kyle Rittenhouse was a white supremacist. Why? Because he protected himself when he was attacked? The thing is it's almost like there are people who are that naive, that they just believe everything that CNN tells them. They just absorb it. They just absorb it. And I hope that one day they'll be red-pilled and they'll be a little bit more objective. They would be a little more suspicious of those narratives, and they would be a little more fair in their judgment and be more tentative. Wait for more evidence. Actually wait for evidence that supports ideas, or you need to be suspicious of those ideas. All right. I don't know. It almost comes down to a trust issue. Some people are more apt to absorb narratives if certain people tell them those, and they've come to trust those individuals. This very, very well could be the case. You know what I mean? Oh yeah, Yoshi reminds me there was the Jesse Smollett individual who actually perpetrated a hoax, a race hoax. And there's actually so many of those as well. Now, this is not to say that there aren't genuine race events or racist events that occur. There certainly are. That's not what I see in the news most of the time. Most of the time, it's these race hosts. But if you listen to them, they just perpetuate this narrative over and over and over and over again, even before there's a courtroom scene. Like nothing. Even throughout the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, for instance, it wasn't a trial about facts. It was a trial about trying to cut through the public narrative. There are still people who think that Kyle Rittenhouse is a white supremacist just because they've been told that so many times. What's the evidence? There really isn't any substantial evidence. There's just circumstantial evidences and ideas that they've kind of externally from external sources they've kind of just attached to it. I mean, they've kind of, the narrative has fed them the points to read into the actual facts, right? And the thing is we see this over and over and over and over again. And more often than not, like 90% of the time, it's something that the more progressive Democrats are saying. Like, which is kind of scary. Like that whole, this Haitian being whipped at the border with this guy on a horse. And this is the worst thing that we've ever seen in America in 50 years or something. Turns out it was a still photo, and then when you talk to the person who took the still photo, they're like, oh no, that has nothing to do with what they're saying. And then video comes out, and it's like, yeah, but you have to understand, you have just drilled into all of these people's minds that this was racist and horrible, and then all the Democrats were jumping on top of it. They did the same thing with Jacob Blake. Kamala Harris, goes and meets with the guy, and like, you do realize this guy was actively being arrested and was going for a knife, right? Or there was the shoot with that girl who had the knife. She was about to stab somebody. It was a good shoot. That circulated for a while, and it's like, people have to understand it's not about their opinions. And it's not about which particular narrative they seem to like at the time. You got to stop. You got to wait. When the whole Chauvin thing occurred, I'm like, yeah, he definitely like hung out on the guy too long. Okay, I'm on that. But people, especially when the dude is like non-responsive at some point, But it was also unfortunate there was other people around. If other people weren't around, they may be more likely to actually engage. In fact, even when the EMTs got there, they didn't immediately give medical attention. They actually got him in the ambulance and drove away before they initiated, because they felt that there were other factors that were going on, the drugs, all of that stuff. I just never bought into that this had anything to do with race. Like I said, people just jump on that bandwagon and just say, oh, there are different races represented here, therefore it's racism. Like, No, stop that. That's like AOC saying that you don't like my policies. You don't like that I vacation in Florida. Well, that's just because you're sexually frustrated old people and you just want to have sex with me. Like, no. It's just kind of ridiculous to. Uh, it's incredibly dishonest too, because who is actually sitting there thinking those things? Like, honestly thinking those things. That's what she thinks. She thinks everybody just who disagrees with her policies don't really disagree with her policies. They just all want her as their wife, and because they're just sexually frustrated that they can't have her as their girlfriend, that they're just going to be mean to her policies, because how could anybody dislike my policies, right? It has to be some other explanation, because these are the best policies ever. Nobody could possibly to dislike these. So it must be because my body is so beautiful, or something like that. She was like saying the same thing when she was kind of playing up her so-called personal experience, with the um, don't know why I keep forgetting. When the people were being entering into the Capitol building when they weren't supposed to. She wasn't even in the Capitol building. She was somewhere else, And then she talks about how she was hiding behind a door, and a police officer, comes looking for her, to make sure she's okay and whatnot. And she's like, I was genuinely afraid I was going to be raped. I thought I was going to be killed. Be like, yeah, she thinks everybody just wants to have sex with her. That's just all there is to it. You got to remember that it's just something she's trying to use to smear others, or she actually believes that. Anyways, I think you get the point of how people can spin stuff. So I echo the cries of a new generation who have stood up and said enough is enough. To what? They are tired of being tired. I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty reading this. It will not stop fighting injustice, even if it costs their lives. That kind of language can be dangerous. So what are we going to do? What steps will we take so that we can all sit at the table of brother and sister? We can have that right now. It kind of reminds me of one thing that Ben Shapiro likes to say quite often is the demand for racism has totally outpaced the supply. That people that is the case has led people to feel a need to like perpetrate these fake race hoaxes and hoaxes and stuff like that. We need to start the conversation about race in an honest manner. What do you mean start the conversation? Is this something that just came to you? No. About constructive change to end the ravages of racism. The ravages of racism. This is rhetoric here. Ravages. Racism is ravaging the countryside. It is raping and pillaging our women and stealing our children. It's poisoning our water supply. And it's burning our crops and delivering a plague unto our houses. That's how bad racism is in America today. We need to bring everyone to the table of reconciliation and a true understanding. True understanding. Yeah, I just learned it. I read Robin DiAngelo's book just yesterday. Now I have a true understanding of what it means to love one another as Christ loves us. Didn't know that before. Thank you, Robin DiAngelo. All right. These are my suggestions for how white Americans can begin the process of creating lasting racial reconciliation and healing. You know what's kind of interesting about this language? What is this white savior complex. It's the white Americans that have to begin this process. They spin everything to the worst. All right, he says challenges that the white culture needs to overcome and address. Like there's a single white culture. Please stop that. Stop it. Stop using that language. At this point, it seems that it may be a fantasy fetish for her, projecting it on others. That's possible. I mean, she's sort of cute, but I don't really get what's going on there with her, anyways. All right, he says, this is what we need to overcome and address. We need to overcome and address denial of racism. Who's doing that? Who is saying that there is no racism in any particular human heart? Every race, every culture, every nation, and every time, racism has welled up in the deepest recesses of the human heart and have sinned against God and his image and others in this way. Now, that's not what they mean. He says, we must stop denying the existence of individual and systemic institutional racism. They exist and are still at work in white Americans in power. All right, note that. This language of systemic and institutional racism here, there's a section in here that gives definitions. I read some earlier. Let me read another time. Oh, nice. They actually have a direct quote from Ibram X. Kendi in here. Yeah, racial abuse. Yeah. 21 racial microaggressions you hear on a daily basis. Let's see here. Almost there. Okay. This is great. All right, so here are some definitions, but let me start with systemic racism. No, that's not the one I wanted to read. It was institutional racism, because that's what we were just talking about. All right. Institutional racism. This is the definition that's given in this document. This is the second time I've read this, and it's just good. All right. Occurs in an organization. These are discriminatory treatments, unfair policies, or biased practices based on race that result in inequitable outcomes for whites over people of color. Yeah. I want to say no to that. All right, how about the definition of whiteness? Whiteness and white racialized identity refer to the way that white people, their customs, culture, and beliefs operate as the standard by which all other groups are compared. What does that even mean? Whiteness is also at the core of understanding race in America. Whiteness and the normalization of white racial identity. I don't even think of myself as having a racial identity. I throughout America's history have created a culture where non-white persons are seen as inferior or abnormal. I don't see that. Maybe I just live in this bubble where I think of people better than they are. And I hope that is not the case, because I can be quite critical of people. White supremacy, a racist ideology that is based upon the belief that white people are superior, which they're not, in many ways to people of other races, and that therefore white people should be dominant over other races, which I reject. It is an ideology, a paradigm, an institutional system. What particular institution are you talking about? It's calling it that it's a worldview. Well, I mean, if you think that one race is superior to another, that certainly is a worldview. You would have to. I don't see how that could exist under the Christian view. It says it is historic and modern legislating, societal conditioning and systemic institutionalizing of the construction of whiteness as inherently superior to people of other races. Whiteness, the construction of whiteness. Let's deconstruct this for a moment. So, and also keep in mind that the definition of racism that they have, listen to their definition of racism. All right. Racism. A prejudice against someone based on race. They don't stop, comma, when those prejudices are reinforced by systems of power. So I suppose what this means is that they are redefining racism to be something very specific. Instead of defining racism based on the attitude towards other people, right? Having a prejudice against somebody for no other reason than the color of their skin is different. That's not racism anymore. That's based on them. That's not racism. Racism is only when those prejudices are reinforced by systems of power, and then they go on to define that the systems of power are controlled by white people. Listen to how this plays out in their definition. The prejudiced treatment, stereotyping, or discrimination of people of color. See, it's completely redefined. This stuff is coming straight out of the woke Bible, right? All right, let's go back to the article we were reading. See, so you could see why there's public criticism and why all of the attempts to try to say that, no, we're not buying into any particular ideology. We're just teaching the gospel. Like, no, you're not. You have swallowed whole the ideology that's peddled by Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Max Kendi. Right, you picked up white fragility and how to be an anti-racist, and this is now the way that you think of race. And you've made a document based in those ideas. They can no longer say that they have no intent of picking up an ideology, that this is nothing but the gospel. No, it's not. If you were just talking about the gospel, that would be all that you would talk about. You would just quote scripture. You would only talk about how we're created in the image and likeness of God, that we need to love each other, and there's various ways and how that can break down and fail. All right, so we talked about the denial of racism. Education about racism and inequality. All right, so we need to challenge the white culture, challenges that the white culture needs to overcome. So it's saying that we need to overcome education about racism and inequality. We cannot rely on our black and brown brothers and sisters. Why do we have to be categorized? I guess it's kind of difficult to talk about the subject without such categories, but isn't like adapting the language of this kind of stuff like part of the problem? Because you begin to think of people as others Anyway, so black and brown brothers and sisters, to educate us about racism. Why can't anybody educate on racism? Like, why is this a question? White supremacy and the inequalities that exist because of it. Like who's joining the Ku Klux Klan today? Are their attendance booming? I don't know. Defensiveness about race. We have to stop taking discussions about racism as a personal attack instead of being open to hearing about our blind spots. We all carry some bias, and the only way we can get past it is to talk about it. And we don't have to talk about it. You can just read books. Right? Yes. The only thing that really, I wouldn't even use the language defensiveness, but I have a reasonable caution when a person is coming to me with highly racialized language and concepts. Because I don't think with that language. I don't think with those concepts on a daily basis. I see people created in the image and likeness of God. I see diversity in the gene pool. So characteristics of eye color, height, hair color, just any characteristic, just diversity in the gene pool, and in cultures, and food, dress, art, music, so on and so forth. I appreciate all that stuff, all of it. My question is why do you want to talk about that all the time? Why aren't we talking about art? Why are we talking about skin color all the time? I see people talking about it more than I actually see cases of it. All right. Little or no exposure to people of color. This is something that's saying that we need to overcome. White people need to overcome having too little or no exposure to people of color. So take an inventory of your personal, work, and church relationships and connections. Do you mostly operate in completely white spaces? If you have opportunities, invite people of color into your home, workplace, and church without any expectations. They should not act as free education for you or to resolve your guilt. I'm going to move on for that one. Become aware of your bias. Yes. Okay, I would say this. If anybody here has a bias, it's okay to acknowledge it and learn about facts. Look at statistics, stuff like that. And be very cautious on how you interpret those statistics. And perhaps more than not, spend time just treating the people around you with the dignity in which a person created in the image and likeness of God deserves. Yeah. Read some fiction, play some video games. If this is the stuff you end up thinking about all the time, then I think that's a problem. Can you talk about it? I suppose you can, like touch upon it once every so many years. If see something in the news or a new statistic comes out, crime statistics, anything related to demographics, I suppose, but I mean, I don't really see it as a big deal unless somebody makes a deal about it, right? All right, he says, stop denying that white privilege exists and learn how it supports racial inequality. Well, here's the difficulty that I have. Like I said, when I was growing up, I grew up in a trailer park. My parents were poor. We were poor. I didn't even know that I was poor. I enjoyed life like anybody else did. I had a couple toys to play with, maybe some crayons, some things to color with. I didn't know that I was poor. neither of my parents had any college education at that point. They didn't receive anything from their parents. They had to do everything on their own. They certainly didn't have things handed to them. My mother had to work very hard for all the things. She built a career for herself. It's not about money. It's about attitude. It's about ingenuity. It's about creativity. It's about intelligence, aptitude, grit, faith in the grace and providence of God, and just enumerate all the virtues, right? Courage and temperance and prudence and whatnot. These are the things that over time you'll find opportunities and things like that, and you're definitely having a really good attitude like that. You're definitely more likely to overlook things. Instead of becoming living with the mentality of a victim, right? People spending so much time living with the mentality of a victim. The woe is me. I think what is even worse and even more dangerous is some of the rhetoric that I sometimes hear coming from the left, telling young people that simply because of the color of their skin that they will not be able to amount to anything in life because white people are holding you back. People are growing up with that perspective in mind and end up interpreting many of their experiences that could be interpreted otherwise, and more objectively so, if it had not been by that brainwashing. Yeah. He says, you may not feel privileged. It's not about feeling. It's, what's kind of interesting is when I went through elementary school, the school was quite diverse. And two of my closest friends were black, and one of their fathers was a lawyer, and the other father was a dentist. And I went to both of their houses at least once, and it was 4 times the size of mine. So you have to understand that when I was growing up, I actually, just based on the few instances of my experience, it would be easy for me to conclude that I was less well-to-do. And I was. But I never considered myself a victim because of my upbringing. And it's not like I haven't experienced. I know that the fatherless home issue is quite huge, and my heart goes out to every child who is abandoned by their father. Woe to that man who abandons their children. It's one of the worst things that they could possibly do. And talk about a scourge on communities. They have such a high fatherless home rate. I know what it's like to have a fatherless home. I grew up in one. And I can tell you that factor alone caused me to spiral out of control and become a disciplinary problem. I didn't graduate high school, and I ended up in jail. Does that story sound familiar to anybody? I experienced it. All right, he goes on to say, you may not feel privileged, but it's likely that you have been excused from numerous negative experiences. Nope. Not me. As well as benefited positively simply because of your whiteness. Nobody told me that they were treating me well or not treating me well because of my skin. Denial of white privilege keeps the current systems affected by racism in place. Well, wait a minute, what systems? And we need to change that. Right? It's all this white privilege and whiteness. Racism is not an individual act. That's a lie. Racism is, in fact, something that can be done by an individual. It is systemic and institutional. Right? This is the redefining of racism so they can perpetuate this problem. So racism is perpetuated by individuals, but the larger harm, don't say it's not an individual act. You need to say that it's both an individual and an institutional if you're going to say that. Yeah, once again, this is written by a guy who's basically echoing Robin DiAngelo, so it's probably not going to be as refined as maybe the ways that she might try to say things. Less experience. Racism is perpetuated by individuals, but the larger harm comes from systemic or institutional racism. Give me a case in point today. It began with slavery, and then it began with... We've always had slavery in every nation across the board. But anyways, I think he's talking specifically in America. It began with slavery, and that sucked. That's too bad. And the notion that black people were morally and mentally inferior. You know what's interesting about that? I actually was listening to a progressive professor say that, this is her words, that black people are not as logical as white people. Their minds don't work like that, and they need an entirely different form of education. And that's why they're failing in schools. Because it's logic. Because of reason. Because, math is racist, right? As we're told by others. And it's continued through Jim Crow. Yep. Black codes, redlining, segregation, mass incarceration, and more. Learn about those things in an objective manner. That's some of that stuff is just basic history. But we're quite past segregation, despite the fact that schools are trying to reinstitute segregation by having separate graduation ceremonies, having segregated dorm rooms to create quote-unquote black spaces, and so on and so forth. Stop trying to be colorblind. While this might sound helpful, he's echoing the language that they're using even. There is no doubt that they've oh my goodness, here we go. This is good here. Try to see the beauty in our differences. Well, yeah. All right, here's some practical remedies for the challenge before us. Are you listening, white people? This is some things that you can do if you happen to have white skin, and from the moment that you were conceived in the womb, that even before you actually had skin, you were inherently racist and an oppressor. So keep that in mind. Have an honest awakening about race in your life. Books like White Awake and White Fragility can help, as well as earnest prayer and completing this resource. This is proof right here. It's talking about Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. Right? Take a personal inventory on race and discuss it with a friend. If you engage a trusted black or brown friend, please make sure they have the emotional and mental capacity to handle this. Intentionally establish relationships with people of color. Why not just have friends based on character? Because bad company corrupts good character. So just, who cares what their skin color is? Just people of good character that are good for your life. Engaging conversations about race. This resource is a great start. It is not a good start. This resource is not a good start. Yes. Okay, so there's a few other things, but not like the things that we've read. All right, so I just got done reading What is Whiteness by the Salvation Army in their Appendix D for Let's Talk About Racism. This document, see, is there a date on it? It says a resource developed to guide the Salvation Army family in a gracious discussion about overcoming the damage racism has inflicted upon our world, taking critical race theory as its modus operandi. Is that how that's said? This was approved by the general in April of 2021, and this tool has been provided through the International Social Justice Commission of the Salvation Army and is designed to stimulate gracious discussion among Salvationists who choose to participate. Yes. This discussion guide represents the Salvation Army's desire for internal dialogue. It is not a position or a statement. It does not replace, supersede, or act as an amendment to the Salvation Army's international positional statement, which can be found, click here, which is quite extensive, and I don't have time to read that because it's now gaming time. We actually ran late in our evaluation of this, so let me get caught up on chat. I do apologize. I'm spending time just thinking about this. All right. White Americans in power, quote unquote, like the ones who found this socialist garbage. Oh yeah, I mean you're talking about the Frankfurt School and all of that. Yeah. Don't worry, their definition of racism would change at some point in time. Don't get attached. Oh, I'm not attached to it all. The irony is Marx was such a huge racist that his own son-in-law was driven to commit suicide because he used the N-word to describe him amongst other ways he treated him. Oh, I've heard a lot of bad things about Marx. So their very ideology is systemically racist. Correct. Yep. Another problem with this ideology is that it is in China where it is... Wait. Another problem with this ideology is that in China, where is the white privilege in China? In Japan, where is the white privilege? There are dominant culture privilege, and it is a human problem that demonstrates an attribute of human fallen nature. In workplaces that are dominated by a demographic, there is discrimination on the small group. For example, nurses who are female will discriminate against male nurses. Reintroducing segregation, at least the Democrats are consistent. Yeah. If I understand correctly, it was the Democratic Party that did not want to end segregation. All right, Get says, imagine being a white person and reading White Fragility. Like, how highly do these losers think of themselves? Actually, I live in Asia. Living here is the first time I've experienced privilege due to my race. I had a friend, social studies school teacher, I think. I think that's what she teaches. We went to the same Nazarene church at one time, and I guess her and some colleagues, and I guess they decided to read Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, and I remember trying to talk to her once and try to explain to her, that a lot of this stuff is a replacement for the Christian perspective. It is the Christian perspective that we should have. And in my previous video about Archbishop Gomez talking about wokeism, he talks of it as a pseudo-religious replacement for Christianity. So, okay, that's my video there. I'm going to take a few moments, and I shall return with some gaming.